Hi, welcome to our first segment of View from the Top. It's a podcast sponsored by the Chamber and Economic Development of the Rutland region and produced by the Hub CoWorks. I'm your host, Bill Lucci, Program Director at the Hub CoWorks. And over the course of the next year, we'll be bringing you conversations with influential leaders from a variety of fields in our state, including manufacturing, healthcare, education, transportation, science and technology, business, and government, and that's a tall order. Today's guest is Mike Pieciak, State Treasurer for the state of Vermont. Mike was the featured speaker at a legislative breakfast that was held on February 12th at the Southside Steakhouse in Rutland. And he's gracious enough to stop by our studio at the Opera House to share his thoughts about his career trajectory that brought him to fill this key role in the Scott administration, learn a little bit about his proudest moments and accomplishments thus far during his career in government, and what he feels are the most critical challenges Vermont faces in the next several years. Mike, I want to thank you for stopping by to talk with us today and to welcome you as a first guest to A View from the Top.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and even more of a pleasure to be your inaugural guest. So, thank you for the invitation.
Well, it was your keynote address or lecture this morning to many of us. I keep on in track with a lot of things that are happening in government in Vermont, and pleased to hear some of the initiatives that you are responsible for. You're taking the charge with at this time, and I think starting off, I'd like to just find out about your Vermont experience. I know you were raised in Brattleboro, and then you elected to. You went to Union College and then got your law degree at the University of Miami, and I'm assuming it was in Florida.
In Florida, yeah.
Not in Oxford, Ohio, where there's also a University of Miami. So what brought you home after you left Vermont for a time? You worked for a while in New York at a couple of law firms, right?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
And what brought you back?
Yeah, well, I think growing up in Brattleboro, I had this really great experience in the community. My parents are still living in Brattleboro. The experience that they showed me when I was growing up, the example that they set, neither of them were involved in politics or in government, but they were both very highly involved in their community, and that really was instilled in me, that sense of giving back and being involved in public service, however that's defined. My dad is a small business owner. He has an accounting firm in Brattleboro, and he helps a lot of other small businesses. So he was very focused in his professional life with helping the community, helping small business owners. We always had to go to the local diner, even though I would complain to him as a little kid, Dad, they don't clean their silverware. The food's not that great. Why do we have to keep coming back here? But he would say it's, one of our clients, and it's important that we support them. And then he also got involved in the community through, he was the chamber president. He helped bring lights to the football field so we could have Friday night games. He helped expand the golf course. So again, I would ask him why he'd been so involved in all those things when he could have been focused on his business or other things. And he would say that Brattleboro had given him and our family so much that it was the least he could do to give back to the community in those ways. So that was my dad, and my mom, similarly involved in the community in different ways. She was 6 months pregnant with me when she helped found a soup kitchen in Brattleboro called St. Bridget's Kitchen, and she's still the volunteer director there to this day, 40 years later. So she was very involved in social justice and helping meet the most vulnerable in our community. I remember some of my first memories are going around with her for Meals on Wheels, delivering food to vulnerable seniors across Brattleboro and beyond. So both of those examples that were set really drove me to public service, and I knew I wanted to do public service in Vermont. As a place I cared the most about. It's home to me. It's the place I thought I could make an impact. But I also wanted to get out and get some experience outside of Vermont. I grew up here. It's been my whole life here. I thought I'd wanted to come back. So getting to go to Miami, getting to work in New York City, those were really formative experiences and helped me get a sense of, what is it like working in, for some of the biggest corporations in the country? What's that demand that's required? What sort of skill set do you need to be successful there? And then hopefully bring that experience back to me, to Vermont. So I always knew I wanted to come back. It was a particular opening in state government that got me back. I was a deputy commissioner of the securities division at the Department of Financial Regulation. So they were looking for a deputy commissioner. They reached out when I was in New York, and I couldn't pass up on that opportunity. And that was just about actually like 10 years ago to the day that I came back to Vermont.
And those experiences that you had in Miami and New York City, did it heighten your appreciation for growing up in Brattleboro, to appreciate the things that you maybe just took for granted while you were living in Brattleboro?
Yeah, it certainly puts it into perspective. I mean, Brattleboro, a city of 12,000 people, I think maybe there were 12,000 people working in the building I worked at in New York, right? So,
Right.
Just the scope and the scale and what that means. But, I think it brought back ultimately why I like living in Vermont, which is that sense of community that you have, whether it's within your community of Rutland or within your community of Brattleboro, or just the community of Vermont. We're a small enough state where I feel like we have a statewide community as well, and we all care for each other. We look out for each other. We might disagree, but we're not disagreeable. It's sort of all of these things that you want to find in a community, and there's some of that in other bigger cities, but it's much harder to maintain and to cultivate, and it's much more anonymous, and people don't know their neighbors, and in Vermont we do know our neighbors, and we intentionally seek them out and make sure things are good with them and that they're integrated into the community. So I think that just really makes it very different from the experiences I had in New York or in Miami.
I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, went to school there, graduate school there, and then decided, much like you, I moved to Cincinnati after graduate school and lived in a large urban area, and then ultimately come back to New England. And people always, as much as I love Cincinnati, love the Bengals. It was one of those things where you have to move away to appreciate something that you normally take for granted.
Yeah, no doubt. When I was 14, when I was thinking about school for college, right, and I for me, I wanted to get out of Vermont. So there's not like I've always, as a kid growing up here, you're like, I want something different, right? And, UVM was just an hour or 2 hours up the road, 2 hours and 15 minutes up the road, 2.5 hours. But I wasn't going to UVM because that was Vermont. And so I ended up going to Union College, as you pointed out, but that was even closer to Brattleboro. That was only 2 hours away. But just the psychological difference of being in a different state and a different experience was really important to me at that time. And you meet a lot of young people now in Vermont that have grown up here and they want to get out and then come back, and that's great. And I think there's something about Vermont that keeps people wanting to come back and keeps people tied to the community even if they don't live here.
I think you and I spoke at the breakfast that my daughter, who's 18, is a freshman at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Student population there is 65,000 students. And she was born and raised in Poultney, Vermont. And, people down there ask her what it's like.
Yeah.
Like, what is it like to live in a village of 2,100 people?
Yeah.
Going to a school of 65,000. And they're sort of puzzled by that. But she's, we're hoping, her mother and I are hoping that, like you, that, she'll spread her wings someplace and then come back because, she really does love Vermont and appreciates what Vermont has to offer, much like you do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is great. And even Castleton, we have a diner much like the one that you had, where you have to check the silverware before you eat at the Bird's Eye Diner. Great food, but check the silverware, right? What I learned today was something interesting. I remember you during the COVID-19 epidemic that it was you and Dr. Levine and Phil Scott going out there every day, letting people know what's happening with the pandemic and everything else. And that's why, until you mentioned it today, I'd forgotten that you were part of that triumvirate. What was that like for you? To go out there every day and be one of the triumvirate on telling people this is what's happening, this is what we're doing. What was that like?
Yeah, well, I remember the first day that I got involved in the COVID response team. We were doing some work relating to COVID sort of on the periphery for our department, making sure that tests were covered by insurance companies on the health insurance side, that There's coverage for treatment for COVID. We're trying to break down the barriers for people to get access to healthcare and to the tests. And so we're sort of working on the periphery of this issue as it was developing in March. And then the governor had a meeting, and the number of the people that came to the meeting were folks that were working actively in the direct COVID response. And he invited me as well, and I had not been working directly in the COVID response. And I remember sitting down, he came in, he sat down at the head of the table, and he said, well, Mike, you might be wondering why I asked you to be here today. And I kind of was wondering a little bit. And he had like a list of like 7 or 8 things that he was worried about relative to Vermont and COVID. And one of the things he was worried about was the disproportionate impact we might have in Vermont because we're an older state. At that moment in time, a lot of the data coming out of China and northern Italy was that the virus was impacting older people more significantly than other populations. So being an older state, he was worried, does that mean we have to have more hospital beds? Do we have to have more capacity in our emergency departments? Do we need to have more ventilators? And asked if I could start to look into that a little bit. And he also asked if I could look into the economic impact that COVID was going to have. And you have to put yourself back in that time period because it's so clear what the economic impact was after, once we've gone through the pandemic. But in those early days, we really didn't know. And I think that was like a Friday maybe or a Thursday. And basically by the end of the weekend, we had kind of identified the economic challenge. It was going to be bad, for a hospitality-based state that relies on tourism. It was going to be significant. Now, it turned out that the federal government stepped in and provided a lot of resources to states that really helped us work through that economically.
When did that become clear that the feds were going to step in and help out while you're worrying about the economic impact locally and how you're going to handle that? When did the feds in that process say, like, you don't have anything to worry about, we'll help you out?
Yeah, it feels like forever because, but I think it probably was within a few weeks of all of the emergencies being declared across the country, including the national state of emergency, but all the local states of emergency as well. It was only probably a few weeks later that they passed the first COVID relief package. And, we were also focused on responding to the emergency, the health emergency that that's partly why it feels like it was such a long time is that, that each day was like a week during that period of time in March. But, the other thing that the governor wanted, as I mentioned, was sort of an analysis around, how will this impact Vermont and how's the virus going to trend here and what's it going to look like. And so for that, we put together a team, both internal to our department that had expertise on actuarial science and sort of, financial modeling that could be transferred over to sort of epidemiological modeling. We brought in some outside experts, academics that were really smart in this area. We ended up getting an outside consulting firm that the head of our team, she had worked and built the pandemic response plan for the CDC previously. So we got all the right people together to support me and our department in doing our work. And, we had our first public press conference, I guess it was. It wasn't with the governor. It was sort of off to the side. It was Dr. Levine and myself and Mike Smith. And we ran through, our presentation that we had been up to that point only presenting internally. And once it was over, I remember a member of the media asking after a whole series of questions, when's the next one of these going to be? And I kind of thought it was like going to be the only one. And then, 150 press conferences later or something, we were just off and running in terms of presenting that information, on such a, on such a continuous basis. But it was so important for Vermonters to have that source of trusted news and trusted information. The federal government was not that at all during that time period. They couldn't be relied on. People were really desperate for stability and for people they could view as trustworthy. And I think that's what we tried to instill. We tried to provide the absolute best information we could at the time, acknowledging that we don't know everything and things could change. But we did present, we wanted it to be as accurate as possible at that moment in time. And I do think, in listening to Vermonters as I go around the state, it does appear like, that was the reception. A lot of people are very grateful for that period of time. They're grateful for our work, but I'm always grateful for Vermonters too. I always say they were the all-stars because they listened to us, they paid attention, and then they acted upon the advice and kept each other safe. And I think it goes back to that community that I mentioned. In New York City, you don't know who your neighbor is. It's sort of, again, you're anonymous. It's sort of theoretical that you have a neighbor. In Vermont, when we talked about doing things that were to your own disadvantage, things that you had to sacrifice for, but that they protected the community. It wasn't sort of a theoretical community. We all knew who the members of our community were and who our neighbors were. So I think that made Vermonters pay more attention and actually follow through on the health guidance that was being provided.
And it made that transparency and that ability to communicate with people and reassure them, like what happened every day when you did these news conferences. It actually got out to people outside of Vermont, which I'd like to think that was one of the reasons why so many people from New Jersey and New York and other parts of the country started looking at buying property and coming up here, working remotely, because they realized this is a safe place, and these people are communicating with us every day to reassure us or assure us that everything's going to be all right. And I think you mentioned in your remarks at breakfast this morning that there was 6,000 people that moved in during that time, all on the higher end of the income bracket.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure, Bill. I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, I don't know if it was necessarily had to do with us and the COVID response, but I think it generally had to do with the way Vermont handled COVID. That I think we set an example that this is a place that deals with these issues in a thoughtful and reasonable way, and they're not going to let politics or some other thing drive the decision making. It's going to be data. It's going to be health science. It's going to be the best information that they can get. And I think in a lot of different states that wasn't the case. And I think people are looking for that kind of leadership. So I think Vermont stood out in the pandemic as a result of that. And we did see, as you pointed out from the IRS data, about 6,000 people in the years 2021 and 2020 moving to Vermont. The Census Bureau shows maybe 17,500 people moved into Vermont. So whichever data set you pick, whatever the exact number is, it's clear that there was a distinct, deviation that decade before the pandemic, we kind of had slow or declining population growth. And then following the pandemic, we saw this, upshoot in our population. And as you pointed out, a lot of those people were younger. On the IRS data, like over 80% of them were between the ages of 26 and 44. So young professionals with a lot of time ahead of them in terms of their career and their families and getting situated here in Vermont, putting down roots. And then a lot of them were from the higher end of the socioeconomic ladder, making over $200,000, 50% of that population or over $200,000. So that signals to me that there were a lot of remote workers, people that moved to Vermont with their job, just simply because we don't have a lot of those high-paying jobs in Vermont. And that's all a good thing on the one hand, right? Because we have more revenue, we have younger people, we have a more dynamic population and workforce that we've talked about. But it also put a lot of pressure on our housing market because we had people move to Vermont, they bought a house, they took it off the market, but they didn't add a job to the local workforce because they brought their remote job with them. So of all of the workforce that remained, there was just so much less housing for everybody that that the cost of housing was driven up, the availability was driven down, and you talk to employers who want to expand, they want another location, they want to add a new line of product, and they just struggle with maintaining their workforce, let alone expanding it, and that's become a real challenge for us. And it also impacts other issues like homelessness and substance use disorder treatment and mental health treatment. When people don't have a stable place to live, it makes it really hard for them to get the kind of treatment that they need to have to stabilize their lives and stabilize themselves and move forward. So it's our biggest issue from my perspective is our lack of housing. We have to continue to find ways to make it easier to build housing in the right places. And I say right places because I think that's critical too, our downtowns, our population-dense areas where there's infrastructure to do it. And then we also have to remove those barriers, and we have to support it financially as well, because we're thousands and thousands of units behind, where we need to be just to meet the demand of the current population. And I think we're going to find that over the years and over the decades, there's going to be more and more pressure for people elsewhere wanting to move to Vermont for climate-related reasons, for political reasons. So it's something that we're going to have to deal with, not just in the next couple of months, not just in the next couple of years, but over the next couple of decades as well.
And you mentioned that number of housing units that that we really need? It's a pretty substantial number, right? Did you say
Yes.
40,000?
Yeah, so there's an analysis from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency that says between 30 and 40,000 by the year 2030 to meet the demand that's expected, over the next 5-6 years.
And that's right around the corner.
That's right around the corner,
Six years from now.
and it takes a while to build housing.
So that leads right into your 10% in Vermont.
Yes.
Tell everybody a little bit about that. Like, what is 10% in Vermont now? How is that going to help?
Yeah, so the problem we were trying to solve for was, we're in this moment where we all know we need more housing. I think there's a recognition broadly across the board. We also have like a land use policy that, makes building new housing somewhat more challenging than other places, whether it's local permitting, whether it's Act 250. And there's been, some efforts to provide some modernization across the board to those two things, which is moving through the legislature. But what it ends up doing is, delaying from when someone starts their project to, when there's a shovel in the ground to when it's complete. And recently, following the pandemic, when something has been delayed, it means that prices have gone up pretty significantly because we've been in this inflationary period. There's been a shortage of labor, so labor costs have gone up. There's been a shortage of certain key materials for building, so those prices have skyrocketed. So we had a lot of projects in Vermont that were ready to go at the start of the pandemic. The pandemic sort of, put the project on the back burner. And then when they started to go build again in 2021 or 2022, they realized, wait, our project is like 25% more expensive. So if we're going to finance that 25% increase and we're going to do it in the commercial market, all of a sudden interest rates are also at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9%. So it really was a double whammy where you were having these cost increases throughout this post-pandemic period. And if you were going to finance those cost increases, you had really high interest rates that made it challenging for projects to pencil out. So we thought with the 10% Vermont program, we could help cut against that during this high inflation period, that we could be counter-cyclical to the market. Now, the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates because they want things like these projects to stop across the country. They want economic development to stop. I mean, it's why they raise interest rates. Now, in Vermont, we're not going to have a nationwide impact if we figure out a way to make sure these projects can continue during this period of high inflation, and that's what we set out to do. So we expanded this program that allows us, for economic development reasons, to invest up to 10% of the state's cash deposits. And the state's cash deposits grew, substantially during the pandemic. We were averaging $200 or $300 million pre-pandemic to more like $2 billion, $2.2 billion following the pandemic. Now, we know a lot of that's federal money that will be spent down, but there's also a lot of new state revenues in there too. So we know that the number is not going to be in the future $200 or $300 million. It's going to be closer to that $1.5 billion number. So we expanded this program substantially by $85 million. We decided that we wanted to lend it specifically to housing. We had a couple of other categories too, climate action and social equity, but housing was our number one focus. And we wanted to do that at low interest rates, 1%, 1.5%, 2%, depending on how long of the term of the loan was. And we've been able to work with great partners like the Vermont Economic Development Authority, like the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, the Northern Forest Center, to get $55.5 million of that money out. And the expectation is that it's going to leverage another $340 million of public and private funds and support about 1,100 new units of housing over the next few years in Vermont. So I think it's a great example of us being able to come in and close the gap on so many of these projects that otherwise wouldn't pencil out in this high interest rate environment and would have to wait another 2 to 3 years. But we don't want to wait another 2 to 3 years because we're in the middle of a historic housing crisis as it relates to Vermont and more broadly much of the region.
And that's something that you really put out there in terms of not just affordable, not just housing for people coming into work, but affordable housing for seniors and people who are sort of struggling financially, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a broad-based program that's going to help a lot of people rather than just one particular
For sure.
segment, right?
And that's what we really like with the partnership with the Vermont Housing Finance Agency in particular. They did an excellent job developing categories. So they're going to support traditional, like large A affordable housing. They're going to support home ownership. They're going to support manufactured home communities. They're going to support workforce housing. They're going to support economic impact projects as well, which we've identified at least 4 of them throughout the state that I think will make big differences in the communities in Bennington and St. Albans and Brattleboro and Winooski as well. So we're really excited about the broadness of who this money will end up supporting. One project in particular, one of the first projects we funded was a project in Virgins that's helping build an assisted living facility. And this was a classic example. They had all their money, they had all their permitting, they were ready to go pre-pandemic, and then they had to delay because of just all the disruption that happened when the pandemic set in. And then when they went to build following the pandemic, their costs had gone up $5 million. And if they were going to lend $5 million at 8% interest, they just weren't able to make the project work anymore. So through VEDA, through the Vermont Economic Development Authority, they lent them the money that came from our 10% in Vermont program at a 1.5–2% interest rate, and that allowed the project to go forward. And that's going to be now a project with the 64 new units of housing in a assisted living facility that is catering toward low and moderate income Vermonters. There's very few assisted living facilities that have low and moderate income Vermonters, but they're building right in downtown Virgins, a dense, housing complex that's going to provide 45 jobs for people that work in that facility. It's going to provide low and moderate seniors a safe place to live. And then it's also going to have this sort of follow-on effect of opening up, dozens of homes in the Addison County area as these seniors move from their homes into the assisted living facility. So I think that's a real strategic area of focus for the state of Vermont, is trying to figure out how to help seniors downsize in their homes, or from their homes, I should say, so that they have a safe place to live that's affordable, whether it's a independent living, whether it's assisted living, but just that they have a place to downsize to that's attractive to them, which then opens up their 3 or 4 bedroom home for another young family to move into. I think that's one of the ways that we'll work ourselves out of the housing crisis, but we have to be deliberate with it.
It's a great strategy. I mean, it would be hard, and all you need is a few success stories to really get people out there who are still questioning whether or not it's an effective strategy or
Right.
not. A couple of success stories. You have one here in Rutland that you either underway or it's just completed, wasn't it? A housing project?
Yeah, so there was historically through this 10% program, we did support the Bardwell House, which is right in downtown Rutland. But there's another project called Hospital Heights, which ran into the same kind of cost overruns and then the challenges around financing those increases. That was one of the first projects we supported with our 10% in Vermont money. And we're looking to do more investment in Rutland City. I view Rutland as a place that has a lot of key components to be really successful. And I think it has been trending in the right direction as a city economically. And we really need in Vermont more broadly somewhere other than Chittenden County to be, an economic driver of our state. And I think Rutland is well positioned to do that. And we want to invest in the city and in the region to make sure that comes to fruition.
There are a lot of people at that breakfast this morning that were pleased to hear you say that. I jotted it down here that you think that Rutland is poised to be that second economic engine outside of Chittenden County that always people point to as sort of that's the place where it's all happening. And what are some of the factors that you believe would make Rutland poised to be that second economic engine for the state?
So I think you have key employers. You have General Electric, you have Casella. Particularly with Casella, you have key employers who are strongly invested in the community. You have other community leaders as well that are from the private sector, from the public sector. Folks like Mark Foley in the building that we're in here today that are willing to make this kind of investment and support the hub, which has that chance to be transformational for downtown. I think it's really important that you have a strong hospital and hospital system. Healthcare is really critical to providing access to healthcare and providing quality healthcare. If you don't have that, then a community really will struggle to be successful. And then you also have, not too far down the road, Castleton, which is an important employer, but also an important place for developing a workforce and developing new talent and having them stay here in Vermont. So I think those are a lot of the key components, and you don't see all of those components in every other community across the state. So I think Rutland is fortunate in that way.
Nice. One of the things that people are, in the community are concerned about, and we've had a couple of meetings here already, is the realignment of the Vermont State College system, and how we recognize that Castleton is vital to the success of the region in terms of workforce development and hospitality and all of that. How do you think the state college system is going to fare with this realignment over the last couple of years? They're under the gun to save what, $25 million in 5 years?
$5 million a year, yeah. So I was on the state college board from about 2015 to 2021. So right before a lot of this transformation was happening, although we were working toward some level of transformation, I was on the long-range planning committee that was sort of looking ahead and trying to understand how do we build a sustainable Vermont State College system, because the system is it's too critical for it not to exist for the state's economic future. If it doesn't exist, we have real challenges. It's a real workforce generator for us. It's not just a workforce generator, but it's helping pull first-generation kids, out of poverty, out of generational poverty, into a future that's much brighter for them and their children. So it's critical from an economic standpoint. It's critical from a financial equity standpoint for individuals. So we knew that it had to be around and it had to be sustainable. Now, how the transition works, it'll be really critical that not only is it unified, but that it also has uniqueness to each of the communities that it's in. And one of the challenges I think we have to work through is, when I was in Rutland 5 years ago, and if you're a business leader and you say, "Boy, I want to think about a partnership with Castleton University," I'm going to call Dave Walk and see how that should work, right? So I think now if you're a business and you're in Rutland and you say, "Boy, I want to get a partnership with Castleton, who do I talk to, or who's the leader?" Then I think the university has to think that through. We have to figure out how the system remains embedded in all the communities that it's in: Randolph, Linden, Johnson, Rutland, Williston as well, so that who to turn to, and there can be those community partnerships that are so critical.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's one of the things that's on the mind of people, at least in Rutland County, with regard to Castleton, was that Dave Walk, and you mentioned his name, who I think 13 years he was president of Castleton, and he really transformed that institution, bringing football back, despite the fact that everybody was wondering what's that going to do in terms of enrollment and the cost for a very expensive program. And Dave sort of figured that out, and obviously it's been hugely successful in terms of getting athletes to enroll there and everything else. And people are wondering now with no Dave Walk there, sort of leading the charge, and Dave was very. People saw him in the community all the time and could come up to him and say, "So what's going on over there?" And there is no person, as you mentioned, like that. Is that on the minds of people in Waterbury that we have to be mindful of that?
Yeah, I make sure to bring it up when I talk to anyone that's part of the state university system, because I think there's a lot of benefits that can come from this unification, from this broader structure, a lot of opportunities for students and a lot of sustainability for the system. But I just from my own personal perspective, I feel like that's one area where we have to figure out how to build in that local, decision making on the one hand, and that local ability to develop partnerships and be a community resource. So I talk about that a lot when I talk to board members, or I talk to people that are involved with the system.
It's if we look at the problem as exclusively related to saving money, then you lose sight of what's going to happen. If it's just always about money, and you're the state treasurer, so maybe I shouldn't say that it's not always about money.
No, it's beyond that. No, it's people and it's communities and it's relationships and partnerships. But, the state system had been one of the least supported systems for a long time leading up to all of this. And, so that has increased, that state support has increased in a way that maybe was unfathomable when I first joined the board. We were always talking about how do we increase state support, and it just, it took the crisis of COVID for there to be a recognition that, the system is more fragile than we anticipated. And so I think it was really just viewed as each have to do their part. We'll put in more money, but we want to see more savings too. I'm saying this from the legislator's perspective.
Sure.
So, there's a need to try to find some efficiencies, but there's also a need to provide the level of support that's necessary to run a strong system. So both of those things are true, and both of those things have to be worked on.
When people talk about VTC, they frequently refer to VTC as that campus in Randolph that is somewhat under-enrolled in Randolph. When I think about it, I think about what they've done up in Williston and
Right.
in Blair Park.
Yeah.
If you do a little field trip, you take people and say, okay, we're going to show you VTC on the other side of what you think, and show them what's happening in Blair Park in the Williston campus. You realize, this is a healthy school.
Yeah.
Doing some wonderful things in a different location. And people just need to be aware of sort of broadening their perspective on what a school is, and where they're operating in multiple places at the same time. They're doing online things like CCV.
Yeah, for sure.
Has pivoted.
Very successful.
Yeah, it's people need to know that information. I just hope they're able
And I
to
think
get that out.
I think those examples, I think CCV is doing this exceptionally well, but they're meeting the demands of students. Like, they're delivering what students want.
There you go.
And Williston campus with the technical college is a good example of that as well, both geographically, because there are a lot of students up in the Chittenden County area, but also programmatically as well, by offering more flexibility, by providing courses that are online. So if you don't meet that student demand, you're not going to, there's plenty of other places that will, and you're not going to be able to bend the will of the next generation into your old model. You have to sort of figure out how that old model is going to develop and be relevant and be sustainable.
Right. It's all as you mentioned. It's all about the consumer, and you've got to develop a product that the consumer is going to buy, and they've done it, I think, really successfully up in Blair Park and Williston.
Yeah.
With VTC. Got a couple more things to talk about. I was really your baby bonds program is really. When you was talking about that, your face lit up. like that program to you, you can see it's near and dear to your heart. As is the Vermont Saves the Pension program.
Yeah.
Your face lit up, and so this is something that you can tell that you're really passionate about. Could you talk about those for a little bit? Talk about those two programs that are coming off.
Yeah, for sure.
Coming online. Thank you.
So, we view these sort of in the broader context of trying to work to provide financial equity into our economy. So how do you help people be in a position to help themselves and to be successful? And on the one hand, with Vermont Saves, that means providing more opportunity to save for retirement and to provide more retirement security. With the baby bonds program, it would mean providing direct resources to young people who are coming from impoverished backgrounds, that it is trying to level the playing field so that they can be successful both in their retirement with Vermont Saves and then also for their young career and for the rest of their career with the baby bonds program. So with Vermont Saves, which is a program that has passed the legislature and is being operationalized right now, it would focus on the 80 to 90,000 Vermonters that don't have access to retirement through their employer currently. They work for a small business, they work for a nonprofit. Their employer's just not able to provide a 401k or some other type of retirement because that can be expensive, it can be administratively burdensome. So Vermont Saves would require that employer to sign up for the program. There's no cost to the employer for doing so. But it would also automatically enroll their employees into the Vermont Saves program. The employees will have the opportunity to opt out of the program within the first 30 days, but they can also opt out at any time thereafter. So it's very flexible from that standpoint. If they don't opt out, then 5% of their payroll will be deducted automatically and put into a Roth IRA that will be invested based on a target date fund that most closely aligns to their prospective retirement date based on their age. Now, they can get in and change all of that. They can change their target date. They can change the percentage of money that's being contributed down to 2%, up to 10%. It is sort of built with maximum flexibility. But the important thing is that there's no ongoing cost to the employer. There's no ongoing cost to the Vermont taxpayer. It's funded by a fee assessed on the portfolio itself, on individuals that are investing for their future. And we're able to provide that at a relatively low price point relative to other products that are available. So we're feeling pretty good about that. And then
you got bipartisan support for that, right?
Yeah, we had unanimous. Very infrequent that unanimous in the Senate and unanimous in the House. Everyone voted for it.
It's when you mentioned that, it was sort of perplexing at first, and then I realized that you were initially appointed to government or worked in the government of Peter Shumlin, a Democrat, and then when Phil Scott came in, a Republican, he kept you. Or I'm assuming he realized the value that you bring to the table, and which doesn't happen very often, where somebody, when a new administration from a different side of the aisle comes on board, usually it's okay, out with the old and in with the new. But you survived that. So do you have any insight as to how that happened?
Well, I mentioned my parents earlier, and my dad is a Republican, and my mom is a Democrat. So, seeing that experience from an early age maybe helped me bridge the divide.
So you cultivated a skill about reaching across the aisle?
Yeah, exactly right, reaching across the aisle.
Good for you.
I joke that they used to be able to watch TV in the same room, and now they can't anymore. So
That's a great observation. That's a great observation. And tell us a little bit about your baby bonds.
Yeah, so
program.
baby bonds,
that was awesome. Awesome program.
So what it's trying. So this one is in the legislature. We need it to still pass. So we're still building. We built a lot of legislative support for it. There are a lot of co-sponsors. We have a funding mechanism for it as well, but we still need to get it through the process. So we're working hard on getting that done. But it focuses on 3 policy goals. One is an anti-poverty measurement, so it's trying to tackle this generational poverty that we see in Vermont and we see in a lot of other parts of the country as well. It's trying to target rural economic development, and then it's also trying to target the goal of retaining young people in our state. So with baby bonds, every child that's born on Medicaid, which is basically about 38% of all babies born in Vermont, they're sort of the more impoverished families, that they would have $3,200 set aside for them at birth that the treasurer's office would invest. And then at the age of 18 through the age of 30, they could claim their baby bond for the purposes of buying a house in Vermont, starting a business in Vermont, or investing in a business in Vermont, going to school or job training, or rolling it over into their retirement account. So at the age of 18, that $3,200 would likely grow to $11,000, $12,000. If you wait to the age of 30, it's growing to more like $24,000. So it can be a significant amount of money for a young person to help them, get that down payment on a home, for them to pay off their school that will have other kind of financial incentives, hopefully, for them. And, there was one student in this process that I met who said that he's going to graduate from UVM. He came from a family where he would have qualified for a baby bond. And he said he would be graduating with about $15,000 in debt. And I started to do the math and said, well, if there was a baby bond, and he took it at the age of 22 when he graduated, he could pay off his debt and be debt-free and have gone to UVM. So I think it really can be transformational for individuals. And the goal is to, like I said, tie people to Vermont, but allow them to have some resources so they can afford to live here, buy a home, start a business. It's rural economic development because a disproportionate amount of children born on Medicaid are born in the Northeast Kingdom and in southern Vermont and places like Rutland versus Chittenden County or Washington County. So it sort of disproportionately benefits those rural areas where we need more economic opportunity. And then it's just that anti-poverty measure that by helping people be established and helping them establish themselves, you can break this generational cycle and they can be less dependent on state resources in the future. So you have less budgetary pressure, and they have more independence, more hope for their future, more resources to make more choices for themselves. So it's really a win-win, all the way around from our perspective.
You're really passionate about that mission, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think it comes back from being with my mom and watching watching her hand out food to people that were in impoverished circumstances and less than fortunate circumstances, going to Meals on Wheels and watching seniors that were living in financially not stable situations. So how can we build more financial stability into people's lives at a young age and at an old age?
And is that something that you were mindful of when you moved back here and said, okay, so I'm ready to come back to Vermont, and now here's what I'm going to give back, sort of as paying homage to your parents. I'm going to give back too. And did you actively sit down and say, this is, I think, how I can make a difference, how I can do this?
Certainly as it related to being in government and being in public service, in terms of what issues we worked on and sort of where my career has led me, that, I think that always comes with a degree of, luck and randomness and whatnot. So, there's that exists. But certainly when I've had the opportunity to lean in with a new idea or with some new power, some new authority, we've always tried to sort of focus on, again, building that financial equity into our economy to help people be in a position to have a more secure financial future.
Well, the people that endorsed you when you were running for treasurer, you ran the gamut of people. You had the state troopers that endorsed you. You had the teachers union that endorsed you. You had members from the LGBTQ community that endorsed you. And you look at the people that actually lined up behind you. It was pretty impressive. It was a range of people from a range of backgrounds, which is, again, going back to the bipartisan thing. It was.
Well, it's important, I think, to work with everybody, right? It's important to find bridges and opportunities to work with everybody. Everyone's perspective, even if you don't agree with it, has some value, and it can help sharpen your point of view, or it can help substantively contribute to the way that you're building a policy. So I think the worst thing we can do is sort of build camps and not talk to each other, because it's not better for anybody. So yeah, I've always tried to find ways to work with everyone, and even just my parents' background. My dad being more financially based, more accounting, more in the business community. My mom more sort of helping vulnerable people, being in social justice. I feel like both of their skill sets and experiences is what I'm trying to meld together by being the treasurer, focusing on obviously the state of our credit rating, on the returns we're earning from our investments, on the strength of our pension system, but then also trying to build in that financial equity and support Vermonters who are less fortunate when we have the opportunity to do that, not just because it's the right thing, but because it also will mean that they are more successful and our economy will be more successful as well.
So with that in mind, what's the future hold for you in terms of any political aspirations outside of where you're at now, or is that something you'll look at when the time comes or when it seems right, or are you planning your career trajectory to go beyond this, beyond the state treasurer?
Well, like I said, there's always some luck and randomness where you land in your career. So we'll continue to see where the luck and randomness brings us. But right now, it's really focused on implementing Vermont Saves. It's a great idea, and it was great buy-in, but we want to follow it through and make sure it's implemented well and that it's successful. We want to get baby bonds, across the board and get that implemented. And even on our 10% in Vermont program, we've distributed a lot of that money, but there's more money to be distributed and more projects to support. So there's a lot of work ahead of us, and I'll wait for that luck and randomness to play out.
and I know I'll be looking forward to that as well. I really enjoyed sometimes these legislative breakfasts are sort of obligatory events where you go and you have a good breakfast and you say hello to people you haven't seen in a while, and then you go back to work. But some of the things that you were mentioning today were, you could just tell that there was a sincerity in your voice when you presented these things that fiscal conservatives might look at and say, Mike, how are we going to pay for this? But even the people that I know in that room who are fiscal conservatives were thinking like, this makes sense. Where we get into a system where we're putting money down for children in the very beginning of their lives, and then we're going to put some money away for people who might not be in a position to save money for when they're leaving the workforce and they're in the, I want to say, the tail end of their lives, but certainly into retirement. And you're looking at it from, it may sound morbid, but cradle to grave kind of thing. It's good for you.
And trying to do it in a way that, neither of these programs are requiring tax increases or new fees. I mean, they're done either in a way that's cost effective or in a way where we've been able to suggest a funding source that doesn't have a budgetary impact. So, we still are mindful of the purse strings and, the need that we need to be able to support our policy initiatives with concrete, and reasonable funding mechanisms. So it's still, I can hear my dad talking to me on my left shoulder, my mom talking to me on my right shoulder. So
it's what a wonderful experience to have, both sides of the aisle, sort of probably your dad on the right side of your right ear and your mom on the left.
Yeah,
ear,
right, exactly. I had those ears wrong. You're right.
There you go. But it was wonderful to listen to you today, and I'm so glad you took us up on our offer to be the inaugural guest. You're an absolute. You're the real deal in my mind. I really had a great opportunity to meet you today. And maybe we'll have you back.
Yeah, that sounds great, Bill.
When you're governor. I'm going to do the exit right now. This is going to wrap things up for our first segment of our View from the Top podcast. Show's brought to you by the Chamber of Economic Development of the Rutland Region and the Hub CoWorks, Rutland's premier location for co-working, office, and conference meeting space. For more information about our co-working options, visit us on our website at rutlandvermont, all one word, .com, or you can give us a call at area code 802-810-8162. Or even better yet, stop by our facility located on the second floor of the Opera House at 67 Merchants Row in beautiful downtown Rutland, Vermont. I'm your host, Bill Lucci, and until next time, I'll be looking for you from the View from the Top.